Hey friends, week 9. I'm really glad to be able to continue to synthesize some of our thinking and talk with you again this lecture about some new stuff that's hot off the press. This is some of the hottest stuff that we're beginning to share. And this really builds on some of the conversations that we've had over the last couple of weeks, meaning this, like we've talked about this idea of transitions, and we've talked about the idea that emerging adults don't necessarily just go through one transition, or they don't go through one transition, then another transition. It's much more of a complicated mess. Some of you have brought up that one transition can influence another transition, and we've talked about those combinations as well. And so in this lecture, I want to see if I can begin to answer that great instinct and try to offer you some of the ways that we're starting to think about this. And I hope that this was really, really inspiring for you. So a little back up, and then we'll run in to get into that. You know, what we talked about before is that we did a literature review and a survey. We recognized the fact that transitions was actually something significant that led us to a conceptual framework of 7 transitions that we tested through the interviews, and we found them to be true. And this led to then something that we called a latent profile analysis, which I want to explain to you. Now, remember, it started out like this, like there's all these transitions and there was so much going on. How do we begin to think about that? And then our team identified these 7 transitions that I've told you about, and this is turning into a really important framework for us. But then we recognize the fact that it's really much more convoluted and not as simple as that, right? Which then led us to say, well, let's do this latent profile analysis. And what is an LPA? Well, it's a person-centered statistical method used to identify unobserved latent subgroups within a population based on observed variables. Okay, so that's a fancy way of saying this. We ran the statistics, a number of variables from our survey, and recognize the fact that there's patterns in the ways that people answer questions, that there's some similarities underneath the surface that allows us to lean into some looks and some views about emerging adults that help us see some similarities and differences. And sometimes these are statistically different that help us recognize that there are these sort of these profiles, if you will. Okay, so we used this based on survey questions 26 through 36. That doesn't necessarily matter to you, but it's really, really crucial that we sort of dug into some of these questions. And what we found is that there are actually 5 states of transition combinations that that emerging adults encounter. And so I want to share with you what those are. So we had the learning profile analysis, and this turns into states. Now, why states? Well, I think that what we recognized was this, is that as we tested our work with emerging adults, and young adults. You'll see I'm using interchangeably this lecture, young adults and emerging adults, because we present a lot of this stuff back to our foundation, Lilly Endowment, that uses young adults. But what we find is that as we talked with emerging adults, that this idea of these 5 states being 5 profiles or 5 personas felt too centering. It felt too like limited in this sense. Most of them would say that they've experienced all these states in different times in their lives, that they actually move in and out of these states depending on the combinations of transitions that they're going through. So the points of these states are not to label emerging adults. You don't fall into just one of these 5 forever. What you're doing is oftentimes you're experiencing a combination of transitions that begin to personify perhaps how one is feeling within those transitions, a combination of transitions that becomes truly crucial and significant. And so we think that these will help us take a closer look, rather than just talking about transitions, to actually look at these combinations. So here's the problem. And we've been talking about this all quarter, right? Like a lot of times when people think about emerging adults, this is the assumption. They're all the same, right? Like, and so we get questions like this. Well, what should we do about emerging adults? Like, how do we get young adults back into our church? Like, what do emerging adults want, right? Like, it's like this monolithic sort of thing, when the reality is much more like what we found. Okay, now here's the findings. These are the findings of how we looked at these. That we found that there were, in these 5 states, there were these categories. There were the overwhelmed hopefuls, the supported optimists, the focused networkers, the disoriented experimenters, and the marginalized resilience. Okay, now this is what we found. This is the descriptive snapshot. But I want us to be careful here, because I don't want us to say, though we do think this is nationally representative, I don't want to say this is the way it always looks. Okay. Because I think what could happen is that some savvy ministry people would be like, I think I'm just going to go after the supported optimists and the focused networkers because they make up almost like 70% of the population. That's not the point. If these are states, it's a good chance that emerging adults will move in and out of these. It's just that in the work that we did, the focus networkers and the supported optimists seem to be the place that a lot of emerging adults seem to inhabit in this survey that we did. You see the difference? So it's almost better to think of it like this, that this is more like a model, that if emerging adults move in and out of these states, that these 5 states seem to be fairly significant. So couple things to remember as I'm going to show you this data is that this stuff is not prescriptive. This is not who emerging adults are. This is just what we found. So it's descriptive, right? We don't use these as labels. We don't say to an emerging adult, you are one of these states. They are lenses to give language to help emerging adults make sense of their lives. And this is something that's been really, really significant as we've talked with already emerging adults about these things. They've been able to say to us, I see myself in one of these states, or I know my friends who are in some of these states, right? That's a good sign of research. Again, this is not a diagnosis. There's not something wrong with emerging adults that they're in these states, right? This is appreciation. Like, this is where they're at. And there's some things that we can learn about their journeys. Again, this is, not individualistic. It's composite. Like, these are the combinations of things. And so you're going to find in the definitions, we use the plural pronouns, we, us, etc. Because there's lots of things flying around within these with these states. It's not like one experience, it's multiple experiences. And so as I share these with you, I want you to try to imagine a young adult you know that may resonate with this description, okay? Try to think about a face or a name as I talk about these things, and I hope that that will be helpful to you. So let's start with the overwhelmed hopefuls, okay? I'm going to give you a lot of stats here. I'm going to have to run through these rather quickly, but I hope it's helpful to you. You'll see when it comes to gender, race, ethnicity, and orientation, that this is these are the statistics that are with that. We have gender about 50%. We see that with regards to race and ethnicity, we're about half white and then a large half proportion otherwise. And then when it comes to sexual orientation, we see that about 70% are straight and about 30 are LGBTQIA. Okay. Also, when it comes to education, you'll see this is like completed education with regards to completing their bachelor's degree or more, about a quarter, about 16% of associate's degrees, and then about 57% are high school. You can see where they live. You can see where they're at with church participation. And we use this concept of participation, not attendance. I've talked about this before. They've engaged the church in some way. So about 83% have engaged the church in some way, and about 17% have said no. Okay. So as I move through these, I'm going to have to move through these as a bit of a clip, but I wanted you to see these stats. And if you need to go back and slow down this video or stop and take a look at these things, kind of let these settle in, because I think this helps us perhaps understand where emerging adults are coming from, how these factors could impact where they're at in these different spaces. Okay. So when we think about this idea of an overwhelmed hopeful, this is the way that we would describe them. We're in a season of life when the volume of transitions is at an all-time high. One change triggers another, and we feel like we're at a saturation point. It's exhausting, but we're still hopeful. We've also changed jobs and yet more than once haven't quite figured out what we're meant to do yet. Sorting out our work and life purposes involves not just what we want, but what others need from us as well. Because loss, taking care of family members and everyday hardships, we honestly don't know how we get through transitions like this without our faith, our relationships with God sustains us. We also care about church because we care about being part of a community. So we're searching for faith communities we can trust and that fit with who we're becoming. We need practical support for stages of life where we're in and spaces that have been created with us in mind. Okay. So, one of the ways that we sort of think about this idea of the overwhelmed hopeful is kind of like an avalanche. Like they have a, a number of transitions that have been laid upon them because of who they are or because who they're responsible for. And so this is a sort of an overwhelming space for them that they're holding at this particular time. Those are the overwhelmed hopefuls. The focused networkers, who are they? Well, we know them to be predominantly women more than men. You can see the makeup of race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. We see with regards to where they're at with regards to education, higher have a college degree or more. You see the community makeup, and then you can see their church participation. And here's the composite that we have for how we describe focused networkers. We're most focused on our work, needing to succeed to meet our immediate practical needs while also laying the tracks for our future aspirations. This work stretches our competencies and our skills to network with the best people who help us grow. We're learning to be financially responsible, which can be both satisfying and overwhelming. Trying to create habits to nurture well-being drums up past issues that compile the challenge. Relationally, we care about our friends and family, yet they feel less stable, less predictable, and less central right now. We're likely to attend church if we can easily find people like us, but we'll avoid churches that go against our beliefs. Life feels like a roller coaster, and we wonder if we can, with each move, if it will be the place we set our roots or if ambition will keep us moving. Okay? So the focused networkers, in many ways, have a goal in mind, and transition for them is like an obstacle to overcome. Okay. And so that's how they're experiencing it. Remember, the first stage transition was just overwhelming. It was like an avalanche, right? For focused networkers, it's more like an obstacle to overcome because they have a goal in mind that's often very connected with their vocation as well. Now, what about disoriented experimenters? Well, again, you'll see the breakdown of gender, race, and ethnicity, and sexual orientation. This is a higher predominance of white. You also find there's a higher percentage of those that merely have high school degrees. Okay, so you see the change in education here. Community and then church participation, you can see that there's a higher non-participation with this group. And here's how we described the disoriented experimenters. We're recognizing that as we change, others in our lives find it difficult to change with us. Choosing a life career has become overwhelming as we worry we'll fail, or worse, choose the wrong career and then have to start all over again, getting further behind and more broke. We keep believing that clearing one's life's next hurdle will set us up for success, but these wins bring new challenges and more work, and we can't seem to get ahead. We're trying to make it by changing and juggling multiple jobs, and we have little margin for deep friendships. We long for them, but we're discovering that relationships require more than making time. They demand that we do self-work to become capable of investing in these relationships. Church is okay. It has sometimes helped us in the past, but it's on the margin of our lives right now. Our faith is personal and helps us, but rarely influences our lives. Okay? So the image that we have for this one is, it's kind of like a maze. They're heading in a direction, and then there's a dead end, and they've got to turn around and come back. And so transition just feels a bit overwhelming as time, and a bit confusing because they're a bit disoriented as they're trying to find their way. Okay, so how do they experience transition? As disorientation. So our first friends, They experience it as overwhelming. Our second friends experience it as a challenge or an obstacle to get through. Our third friends see it as this disorienting experience in their lives. What about the supported optimists? Well, you can see here with regards to gender, they're split. You can see the race and ethnicity, their sexual orientation, where they're at with regards to education, community, and church participation. Here's the way we describe them. As young adults, we're on this beautiful journey. There are ups and downs, but the destination is always beautiful and intersects with other great people who are on their own journeys as well. Our parents and church communities are so supportive of us. They've helped us navigate major changes in our lives, like getting married, buying a home, moving, physical and mental health challenges, and we're so grateful. We do our best to support them as well. Some of us have experienced short seasons of doubt, but overall, our faith in God is growing and maturing. We talk to God every day, read the Bible, and have grown closer to God through the challenges and transitions we've experienced. At this point in our lives, church attendance has become something we choose and do and desire rather than just being a holdover from having grown up in church. Okay. So for supported optimists, we see that there seems to be in their mind, their perception, a tremendous amount of support that they have. And so for them, like a supported optimist, like transition for them is like an adventure. It's actually rather exciting because there's possibility and support with them along the way. Okay, so we have our friends who feel that transition is overwhelming. We have our friends that see transition as an obstacle. We have friends that see transition as confusing and disorienting. And we have friends that see transition as an adventure. And then we have the marginalized resilience. Again, you can see their gender, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation makeup. Again, what we know is that all these different statistics cover all these different states, but there's just oftentimes some significant snapshots that we see here. In this particular section, we see that sexual orientation, about a third would identify as that. Here's their education, community, and look at the church participation. It actually is rather high. Okay. And here's how we described marginalized resilience. Who we are doesn't necessarily fit with our current or past faith communities, what they want us to be. Yet faith is still important to us. So we found or are seeking new faith communities that embrace us. Our relationships with our parents are complicated. We appreciate them, but the relationships are often fraught, and we have to advocate for ourselves and what we need. We have lost friends along the way, to becoming more who we truly are. Finding a spouse is important to us, but we're trying to surrender this to God. Through all we've been through, we know Jesus is the only one upon whom we can truly rely. For some of us, we are very involved in our church. Others, we attend about half the time, and still others of us, we've been too burned in the past. Yet we are committed that we are connected. Small groups have been important, safe spaces for us to be ourselves, be held accountable, and grow. At the end of the day, we participate in church when church feels like family. Okay? So this group feels in some ways like they've been rejected or marginalized in some ways. Yet there's a resiliency that you can read in this composite that we find really significant. And so in many ways, we feel as though they've sort of been tested through fire, that though their lives have been challenging, it's refined them, and there's a deeper sense of conviction that seems to be coming through. And again, this is another way that this particular group of people, the state experiences transition. So this is our model. This is what we have discovered. And if we took this a little bit further, I find this really, really interesting. That supported optimists are experiencing transitions as an adventure. And perhaps a way to think about this is based on the composite. Maybe what they're seeking is a church that inspires them, right? If life is an adventure, they need inspiration. Like, is the gospel an adventure, and what does that look like? And perhaps another way to think about this, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but as we've talked about identity, belonging, and purpose, maybe this is the way that they're conceptualizing their IBP. Like, I'm content, I'm supported, and I'm enjoying the direction that I'm going. Remember, focus networkers, they experience transition as a hurdle or an obstacle, right? They're seeking a church that launches them, right? It's got to fit to the purpose of where they're going because they seem to be fairly focused on that. So they want a church that not just inspires them, but actually launches them into what they want to become. And so they're probably looking for resources or mentors that can actually do that. So with their IBP, again, I'm focused, I'm network, and I'm progressing. This is sort of that focus there. When it comes to disoriented experimenters, again, they're experiencing in this moment a transition as a maze, and so they're seeking a church that grounds them. If they're disoriented a bit, they're looking for a sense of like how do I find this sense of stability? How do I find this sense of where true north is? And so their identity is I'm confused. Their belonging is I'm disconnected, and their purpose is I'm really searching, right? So there's still a sense of searching. When it comes to the marginalized resilience, remember they've been tested with fire, right? So they're seeking a church that honors them, that sees them for who they are. Remember this idea of they want to be in a place that feels like family, right? With their IBP, I'm misunderstood. I'm readjusted. I'm enduring, right? There's this sense of working through the things that they're going through, even when things have been challenging. And the overwhelmed hopefuls, or remember the transition for them is experienced as an avalanche. Like there's just so much that's coming at them. And so they're seeking a church that supports them. I find this one really interesting in that I think a lot of times when emerging adult joins a church, we just assume that they want to volunteer. And so we try to sign them up for something. Like an overwhelmed like hopeful probably just needs support. Like to ask them to do one more thing in an overwhelmed state is probably not the bandwidth that they have at this time, right? And so they're tired. They're spread thin, and they're sacrificing a lot already. So, I find that this can be really, really helpful as we think about like what is an emerging adult who's going through transitions, often them in a particular state, like what do they need from their mentors? What do they need from the church? And perhaps this begins to give us some a language for that. So maybe you could just take a minute and think about this. And this is just a question that we're going to ask our group in 2 weeks that's coming to hear this research for the first time. Like I'm inviting you into that. These are the questions that we're going to ask. Like pick a young adult, an emerging adult state. Like pick one. Like how might faith communities engage and support a young adult in this state, an emerging adult in this state? Like, what would ministry look like for these states? Rather than the monolithic, what are we going to do for all our young adults? How do we begin to think about what they need from the faith community? How do we show up where they say they need us the most? This is where we're driving, and we think that some of this work is giving us some new language and some new lenses to think about that. And I am inviting you in to reflect on that with me. I hope you found this helpful. I'm excited to share it with you. Again, you're some of the first people I've shared it with, and so I'm really honored for you to take the time to do that. Peace.